I am thrilled to welcome back my good friend Kate Leto to Product Therapy. Kate is an executive coach and author of the book, Hiring Product Managers Using Product EQ to Go Beyond Culture and Skills. She's joining me again today to talk about the very important topic, psychological safety. Kate, as always, good to see you. Welcome back to Product Therapy.
Thank you. It's so nice to be back.
Lovely. Kate, we spent a lot of time in our last conversation talking about emotional intelligence, and I have not been able to shake that conversation since we had it. It's almost like I am looking for it clearly now. I can distill it. I'm trying to coach and guide people more around this. I've talked about EQ in the aspects of your inner game and your outer game to people, but as leaders, one of the things that always struck me is the environment in which people do their work. I've always talked about trust being foundational to empowering teams, and this concept of psychological safety comes up. I kind of love, again, to anchor in on how you define it, how you see it, so that everybody's on the same page. What is psychological safety? Maybe how does it connect to EQ? How does it differentiate from trust? Let's start there.
Definition of psychological safety. So I see psychological safety as a shared belief amongst a group of people or a team, could even be, an organization, that it's safe to be able to express their opinions, express their ideas, maybe even make mistakes without negative repercussions. It's a safe space.
I have seen two constructs that tend to create interesting reactions to people. One is this idea of a safe place. People say, well, this is work. We have to have some hard decisions. This is not your home. And then some people is like, well, safe spaces, this is a culture of like a family feeling. I really want to kind of understand this idea of a safe place. Why does it matter that it's a safe place in a work environment for us to share ideas, give input without feeling embarrassed or criticized or ashamed? Why does that matter at work?
I think it's a huge thing. I think there's a big difference between working in an organization that has psychological safety and saying we're a family. I think there's a big distinction there. So psychological safety is that ability to be able to say, like, I don't agree with what you're saying, right? Which can further a conversation, can further an idea, and make it even better. It also means that you feel comfortable enough to take a risk, right? To try something in a different way, in a way that maybe the organization hasn't done before. And you can feel comfortable taking that risk or confident in taking that risk that you're not going to get reprimanded if it goes wrong, right? You're not going to lose your job. So I think in a lot of ways in our work, we kind of think of things have to be kind of done a certain way. We have to be very kind of disciplined and focused and to be efficient. This psychological safety doesn't take away the ideas of being efficient or being accountable. It actually lays a healthy foundation for getting more people engaged in that.
First of all, I always say that the idea of a team is complementary skills. You're pulling a bunch of different people together for a reason, different perspectives, different ideas, different personalities. You're bringing different complementary skills in order to accomplish something you cannot as an individual. And you're calling out that without psychological safety, you don't get the value of those complementary skills because people do not contribute their ideas, their thoughts, their input because it doesn't feel safe to do so.
Well, I don't know if it even is necessarily related to working with groups that have complementary skills, because I think psychological safety, when it's in a really good place in an organization, is when you're coming from diverse backgrounds, you have different experiences, you have different ideas, and you're in a culture where it's okay to share what that is bringing for you in your work, right? So it might be a different way of approaching a problem. It might be a different way of communicating about the work that you're doing. It opens things up for more engagement and more discussion in a way that organizations that don't have psychological safety, where they might just all be very polite to each other, where they might not actually, you might be in meetings where it's just completely silent. Nobody's offering new ideas or different ways of doing things. That's a sign of organizations that don't have psychological safety. Organizations with psychological safety, I think, are more dynamic, right? Because people are bringing in their ideas and they're feeling good about doing that. I use the word comfort, and I'm not sure I used it in the right way, because psychological safe cultures are not comfortable, right? They're engaging, they're dynamic, they're empowering. And I think having that level of psychological safety makes a huge impact on our motivation to be at work, capacity to bring new creative ideas, to be innovative in the work that we do. So I think it's kind of a no brainer.
Yeah. One of the early things that struck me about the concept of psychological safety, Google loves to kind of study teams and behaviors with people. They had this big project trying to understand what differentiated some of their highest performing teams from others. They had all these theories or all these hypotheses of what could drive it. Kate is a veteran. She's on the team. Kate had 12 PhDs. She's on the team. Or, they had this theory, good managers or something in here. And they got thousands of teams. And what came back from this study was that the single biggest factor for high performance in a team was this concept of psychological safety. People felt comfortable sharing ideas without being embarrassed. People could move from conflict to commitment in some ways. And, even when you looked at the list of things in there, people felt impact in their work, meaning in their work. You didn't see all these usual signs of, the boss was great. I got good feedback. My pay is great. This was the single biggest factor. It kind of prompted me to kind of say, okay, well, is it just trust? Maybe kind of differentiate trust from psychological safety for me, so that I can make sure I'm not confusing the two in some ways.
So, in my mind, trust is something that's between two people, right? It's dyadic, I think is the term for it. Me and my manager, I could trust my manager. I could trust a member of my team, right? It's an individual concept. Psychological safety is amongst teams, amongst groups of people. So I could trust my manager, but I could also be in a meeting where I'm not going to speak up without fear of risk, that I hold back because I'm concerned somebody's going to say something bad about me or my idea. You could have trust with members of your team, but you might not feel like you have psychological safety amongst the entire team itself.
So I trust you versus it's safe. Yeah. It's kind of how you're differentiating it. So pretty much I could trust you, but in the team, I don't trust the environment. Now, is that because there could be one person in an environment that could just hurt the safety in that environment?
Could be, there's always that person around somewhere in an organization that has the loudest voice or that, is kind of taking a lot of the air and the space in the organization and demanding that things are done a certain way. So yeah, it could be one person, could be a couple people. It could just be the way that the group of individuals comes together and the dynamic of that team. It doesn't feel safe. It doesn't feel like you can take risks. It doesn't feel like you can speak up. It doesn't feel like you can be candid. I've worked with many organizations that, are going through transformations and working with leadership teams where the members of the team all have, individually, they have a lot of respect for each other. They have a lot of trust for each other, but you put them together in a room to make a decision. Oh, different things happen.
So let's diagnose and try to go a little deeper with this. So I'm in a team meeting or in a group setting. Somebody shares an idea. Nobody speaks up. Nobody creates a counterpoint. People are kind of quiet in their stuff. You kind of sense that energy. I'm a leader here. I'm sensing in my mind, this is a great definition of we are lacking psychological safety here. How do I identify what's creating that? How do I know it's not, Kate is typically screaming at people, something is happening, it's a team dynamic. How do I diagnose the root cause of that lack of safety?
It's hard to do, and it's usually not just one thing. It could be you as the leader of the team are maybe shooting down ideas without giving people a chance to, explain their thinking. It could be that there's not space for people to actually be curious and bring up questions and ask different things in order to get bought into an idea or a decision or whatever it might be. We talked before in our last conversation about emotional intelligence, we talked about self-awareness, being so important. And I often think emotional intelligence is different than psychological safety. Like emotional intelligence, I think, is an enabler, and psychological safety is an outcome. It could be that different members of your team maybe are low in some different areas of emotional intelligence, of self-awareness, of dealing with conflict. There's so many different things that it could be. But it does usually show up when there is silence in meetings. Nobody's contributing. Nobody has a new idea that they're bringing forward. When there's no pushback on ideas that the leader might be sharing or the decisions that might be kind of coming down, that there's a lot of politeness and not a lot of candor, right? It's nice to be nice, but we also, have to be true to the questions that we have. and the emotions that we have around it. So it's hard to diagnose the exact thing, but it does show up in how the group operates and behaves.
I want to make sure we are saying the same thing loud and clear. I called out that Google study because it's saying the single biggest factor that was found in studies of thousands of teams that led to high performances teams was psychological safety. You kind of called out in some ways that impossible, like high EQ with all that self-awareness and stuff, it could be an enabler of getting that environment in place here. As a leader in an environment, I'm recognizing these signs you're showing. People are not speaking up. You're not, okay, I'm getting a sense. We've got an issue here with not the type of psychological safety that will lead to high performance in a team. Let's start to work on this. Okay. We need to coach this playbook. Hit me up on the steps. You're saying there are lots of factors, so maybe I cannot spend my time trying to diagnose all of the root causes of what's driving it, but I want to get it better. Where do I start and where do I go next?
Well, as a leader, you start with yourself, to be honest. It's taking a look at your behaviors, even your body language in meetings, your presence in meetings. If you're on Zoom calls or even if you're real life at a conference room table, are you constantly looking at your phone or another monitor or something like that and not really engaging? That's not going to make people feel like, "Oh, okay, now's a great time for me to bring up a new idea." You need to look at how you're handling people when they do speak up. Are you encouraging? Are you, appreciating that? Are you asking questions? Are you bringing curiosity? You need to be able to model these behaviors. Are you able to say when somebody asks you a question and you're not sure about the answer, are you able to say, "I don't know, but let's go find out"? That's a hard one for any leader to say, "I don't know." But modeling that behavior helps others around you see that, like, it's okay to say, "I don't know," right? Instead of just trying to make up an answer on the fly. So these are some of the key things that you can just start out doing. You can encourage people, to speak up, even little things like that, doing little exercises at the beginning of meetings, like having check-ins or check-outs with your team. I'm not sure you're familiar with those. Just a check-in question at the beginning. What's on everybody's mind today as you're coming to this meeting? Starts to invite everybody in to share what's going on, what they're thinking about, and starts to create that psychological safety.
Step one is hard to hear. Step one is start with you as a leader. You're calling out that the most likely reason for poor psychological safety, a poor environment that people are not speaking up, sharing ideas, being vulnerable, is probably leadership. And so you're kind of saying, let's get some self-awareness. We talked about knowing yourself. Maybe I need a trusted critic. I feel like I'm learning some things here, Kate, to kind of tell me things that I may be doing that may be hurting psychological safety. And I love that you kind of said that I don't know, like, you're modeling some vulnerability, you're modeling openness, you're being aware of how your actions may be affecting the environment or the space. So, the highest paid person in the room, the person with the loudest voice in the room, has a significant impact on the environment and the space. So it's like step one is maybe you should kind of do some self-inventory of like, what am I doing that could be hurting psychological safety? And then in turn, how do I model something else? One of the things that is often the hardest things for me when I'm coaching leaders, it's so unfortunate that when people become a leader or a manager in many companies, some unwritten rule tells them they've lost the ability to say things like, I don't know, I'm not sure, I need help, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. And I don't know where that rule came from. And it's even reinforced with employees say, oh, you don't know. I thought you were the leader. That maybe pushes that insecurity more in leaders. But you are talking about something very hard to do. Modeling vulnerability in people and making it your insecurity known to people. How do you coach a leader to get comfortable with that?
You got to unpack on why you're not comfortable with it, right? So a lot of leaders have this hero complex. We want to save the day every day, right? We want to make sure everything's okay, everybody's high performing, everybody's feeling good, everybody's motivated, and we want to make sure that we're at the center of that. That's based on the myth that we have of what a leader should be. And it's kind of nice to have that leader around from time to time. I'll admit that. That's kind of handy. It's inspiring. However, it's got a lot of negative components to it too, right? So when a leader does take on that kind of hero complex, and says, always has the answers, right? Never says, I don't know, is always going to take care of anybody else's problems. They're not building an organization where, people can solve their own problems, that they're learning to do that on their own. That's kind of a key skill. Problem solving skills. We should all have them. People aren't learning how to raise their hand and be like, oh, but what about this? I got a new idea. Could we try this? All of that gets pushed to the side because the hero is taking center stage. In my work with leaders and my coaching work with leaders, when we talk about psychological safety, it's often, and we start with them, we got to start by understanding where that desire to always be right and always save the day is coming from and how we can work with that.
So, I mean, we can coach this, and leaders have to kind of practice shifting their focus from who is right to what can we learn, or, I have the answer, to what does the team think. I see those environments where everybody looks to the leader for all of the decisions. They look to the leader for the validation. They are not even asking questions. And I don't know if it's the psychological safety aspect when someone says, like, I think we should do this, like kind of leaning into whether the leader will shake their head or kind of disagree with them rather than kind of saying, here's some evidence I have that it may be contrary to that. Is that reinforced maybe because a leader has a strong perspective or point of view? How do I differentiate as a leader my contribution? Like, I have an idea. How do I share it with the team without the team taking my idea as a direction or decision?
Yeah. Well, ideally, you're going to have a team that's going to want to poke holes in your ideas. That would be great. But doesn't always happen. So I think a lot of it is in how you frame it and bringing it to the team, how you're presenting it. Often it's presenting maybe a few ideas, I'm all about options. I'm all about having options. And so presenting teams with, 2 or 3 ideas, 2 or 3 options. Hey guys, let's talk through what's the pros and cons. What makes sense here? What's a horrible idea that we should shelve? What else do you got? What do you guys think? What do you want to bring to the table? And also, and kind of saying that up front, I don't know if this is a great idea, right? I'm bringing it to you because I'd love to get your input on it. You know this better than I do, So I think a lot of it is how we frame it, how we frame that conversation, and how we encourage people to be curious and to really kind of engage with it versus just like take it on a silver platter and go execute.
How does a leader manage that interaction in a way where a team doesn't feel like, are you trying to shift the accountability of this from you to us? How do you manage that dynamic? And maybe also talk about the flip side of this where people kind of argue like, I'm trying to hold people accountable and psychological safety, that whole stuff creates this whole imbalance.
Yeah, I'm going to start with that one, actually. So just because there's psychological safety does not mean people are not accountable. That's not it. So I think psychological safety lays the foundation for a healthy type of accountability, right? Because I think a lot of times when we think of accountability, like you said, the boss has this idea and now the team feels like they have to execute. And if it goes wrong, it's all on them. They're accountable for it. I think that goes back to kind of a legacy way of thinking about accountability, that it's your responsibility and there's going to be negative consequences on you if it doesn't work, if you fail, if the idea flops for whatever reason. I think with psychological safety, you are still accountable, but we've created an environment where you have the ability to like raise your hand and be like, I've got questions about it before I get going, before I start working on this. Or maybe halfway through, I can't get it done. I can't meet the deadline. That's not going to be held against me. It's going to be something that I'm in a way kind of applauded for because I'm bringing it up. It's actually creating an environment where it's okay to even say like, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. Halfway through the project, I need help. It's okay to say I need help. So I think that in a way creates a new level of accountability, right? It's not passing the buck. It's making it possible for people to learn as they're going along and be more accountable.
Can you have too much psychological safety? I mean, is there an environment in which like everybody speaks up, everybody's talking, everybody's chiming in, everybody's arguing about everything, I am the leader, stop. Like,
Yeah, totally.
oh,
Yeah.
is that too much? I mean, I don't know. Is that different from like, is it an excuse for people to just be argumentative, play devil's advocate every time, be that person? And how do I differentiate or where do I draw the line?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. You gotta have boundaries, right? And I'm thinking the more I could see something like that happening as a team is really trying to figure out what psychological safety is. That's kind of part of a maturity process. I could definitely see that. But I would hope that with the help of a leader who's aware of how you're trying to kind of guide this and kind of bring everybody along on this journey, knowing when you need to have some sort of intervention. Another great ritual that we use in product that I think is super cool for building psychological safety is retros. Having retros with your team, with your organization, with your group, whatever it might be, to talk about what's going well with us as a group, what's not going well, and what we might want to do differently. And with that, checking in on, how are we doing in terms of asking our questions and moving things along and hitting our deadlines, you can definitely have that conversation and notice how the psychological safety is either starting to build or not within the group, because the team will either engage and be upfront and be honest and be communicative and have some candor in their conversations, or they're going to be holding back, right? They're going to be silent and quiet. But I think that is a perfect opportunity for a leader to be like, guys, I'm noticing this. We're kind of skewing the other way. What do you guys think? Is this something we want to learn how to kind of bring back and kind of get under control a bit more?
There's kind of this calibration zone of nobody's talking to everybody's talking and we've stopped listening and we're arguing and fighting. And they're not different sides of the coin. They're just, you haven't calibrated what psychologically safe for your team is with the team dynamics.
Exactly. You're going to go through a bit of a roller coaster. It's kind of like, I would imagine what it'd be like raising a teenager a little bit, right? You're going to have some ups and downs. I don't know if I've ever seen a team go from being non psychologically safe to being perfectly, a perfectly psychologically safe team in a straight line. It's not linear. You're going to be going up and down a little bit.
Do you look for this as you're hiring a team? You may be looking at certain people that love to speak up or that are very outgoing and some people that are analytical and thoughtful, and you're trying to balance that. Is the idea of good leadership in a team, you're trying to elevate the voice of everybody and make sure everybody's heard and contributed. But, do you look at that as you're building your team if everybody is quiet and doesn't want to speak up, and or everybody is just wanting to chime in and not listening? Like, do you try to deliberately look for people that are enablers of psychological safety?
Yeah, I don't know. It kind of goes back to what you're talking about with Project Aristotle, right? And Google tried to do that. They tried to manipulate the teams. Like, what if we do it this way and put all a bunch of PhDs on the team? That'll be a great high performing team. Or, what if we, do the exact opposite? If there was a way to do that, I think you and I would both be super rich, right? We would have the answer to every organization's challenge when it comes to team topology. So I think it's something to be mindful of. I think it's difficult to plan for.
Now, a lot of this in creating psychological safety does a lot of finger pointing to leadership because they are responsible for the culture and environment. From a team's perspective, what are you coaching in a team that could help psychological safety? How do you reach out to a team? Obviously, you've called out if leaders have better self-awareness, have better EQ, if leaders model vulnerability, if leaders start to coach trust, active listening. There are many things leaders can do, check in with questioning, all of those kinds of things will help. But from a team perspective, are there things that you can start to instill or coach in a team to improve this?
Yeah, I think some of the basics are bringing more curiosity to the team, doing something simple like asking clarifying questions before you respond. That sounds simple, but it's really hard to do. It's really hard before you just respond to what somebody's idea with yeah, that's great, or no, that's awful, to form a question about it, right? To help you form an opinion. And I think bringing curiosity through something simple like a clarifying question can help shift the dynamics of the team. So I think that's a big one. And I do think active listening is another big part of it. It's a human skill that you can learn and get better at. So I think there's different exercises around bringing the two of those together. In a lot of ways, they're essential skills of coaching, of what coaches do, and what we try to bring to organizations to help people be, in a way, kind of more present in the conversations that they're having at work.
I love that a lot. So you're coaching curiosity in some ways. You're coaching better questioning in some ways, seeking to understand before you're understood in many ways, and this active listening as a conduit. One of the techniques I often, I mean, I talk about practice a lot when I coach with people. And I tell people what you do in practice, you do in the game, but even in modeling behavior. So I say most people don't know what is acceptable or okay in an environment unless they see a leader do it. And leaders model what the culture should be. So, if I'm like even trying to modeling, it's okay to say if I go to someone, I say, Kate, the team is struggling with speaking up or conflict or responding to things. We're going to have a whole team meeting. And in the middle of the meeting, I want you to raise your hand and say, that's a stupid idea. Yeah, I'm like, in the middle of the meeting, in front of everybody? I say yes, because everybody in the company is now very curious as to, what's going to happen now? They are very curious about how I will respond. And so, it's like, Kate, tell me more. Why do you feel that's a ridiculous idea? Kate shares her point. We talk about it. And then Kate says something like, you know what? I'm not really sure I agree with all the components of it, but it seems like this is an important strategic decision. So I'm going to commit to doing anything I can to making it work. What have I just modeled to people? It's perfectly okay to disagree and still commit. It's perfectly okay to speak up and share something contrary. And unless you model that behavior, people will not know it's okay. No matter how much you say, you can write in an HR document or in a company newsletter, speak up and share your ideas, no matter how bad. Who is going to be the first person to try this test? And so you kind of almost have to go to someone and say, we are going to practice something in front of everybody to demonstrate that it's
Right.
okay. And I think, when you called out modeling vulnerability, openness, I always kind of want to reinforce to leaders, you have to practice it. Even find a safe place with a coach to practice what you're going to say before you show up in the game with
Right.
it in some useful way. So I really love this idea of reinforcing kind of a learning culture, modeling some of those things out to people. I love that you've talked about accountability, kind of psychological safety and accountability, and even performance. Now, we kind of talked about vulnerability, and there's some mushy feeling for people as leaders around vulnerability. How can leaders do it in an authentic way without it feeling like an act? How can they model out like safety to people?
If that vulnerability is not real, if you're not really feeling like, I don't know the answer to that, and secure with that, then it's going to feel fake. Yeah, so there's practice that comes in handy, absolutely. But then again, it's also doing some work maybe to understand, like, why do you have such a hard time saying I don't know? What's going on there? Does that go back to the hero complex? What's stopping you? What's blocking you from showing some vulnerability to your team? Because unless it does feel real, unless it's coming from you, if you're just putting it all in that mask to say like, well, I don't know. And, watch, I'm going to say, I don't know 5 times today. And therefore I will be modeling vulnerability. People are going to pick up on it.
Meaning, like, if I cannot be vulnerable with my leader, will I be vulnerable with the people that report to me?
It's contagious. Kind of like what we talked about with emotional intelligence before. It's one of those things, and research shows that, starting at the very top, your CEO, your main person has got to be able to say, I don't know. Or let's find out, or I'm unsure. I'm a bit nervous about trying this too, but we're all in it and we're going to give it a go.
We've created such a standard for leadership that we almost look at that as weakness, or you didn't do your homework, you didn't prepare. How can you not know? How can you not be sure? Who else will be unsure? Who else will be sure if you are not, Mr. CEO? So we are deemed to be the hero. We are deemed to have this strong persona that we've got it all figured out. And you're saying to create a better safe space, we have to model out we don't have it all figured out.
Yeah, I know. That's why a lot of people don't do it. That's why psychological safety is something that we're here talking about, because a lot of organizations haven't been able to bring it to life. I'm not saying it's easy. If it was easy, every organization would have it. But it is kind of bringing that humanity into your work. A lot of places actually would see that ability for a leader to say, I don't know, as a strength and not as a weakness.
Saying I don't know every day, forever, is not the leadership aspect we're advocating. You're saying like you could be vulnerable with not knowing, but creating an environment to go know, to go get
Right.
the facts, to go get the answers as
Yeah.
quickly for people. I love that. What a great conversation for me, just kind of in the mental model about, the difference between I trust you and it's safe here, kind of understanding that psychological safety is the culture that happens when some of these things are applied well, is the environment where people feel safe to speak up, where people are doing so without fear of judgment or criticism or retaliation. And, we're anchoring over and over again. It is essential for empowered teams, because empowered teams depend on trust so that people can give them problems to solve than tell them to do, but they are also dependent on an environment for good work to occur. So I love that I'm able to kind of distinguish psychological safety from trust. I'm glad I can actually distill what it means to hold people accountable in this kind of environment and the barriers of psychological safety. Kate, I cannot say thank you enough for the time today, for the insight, just for bringing your energy to some of these topics that most people ignore in kind of how they coach teams. We focus a lot on those hard skills, but these are the real skills, these human skills. And I've enjoyed my conversation with you today. Thank you so much for being on Product Therapy.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks, Christian.
Want to learn more? Until next time, please check out svpg.com, sign up for our newsletter that Mike Hagan puts out, join us for one of our workshops near you, and get access to all of the articles and content we put out. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Until next time, have a good day.
A quick disclaimer: while this podcast is named Product Therapy, it is not hosted by licensed therapists or mental health professionals, and it is in no way a substitute for professional mental health services. We recognize the importance of mental well-being and encourage anyone facing personal difficulties to seek support from qualified professionals. See www.findahelpline.com.